All right, diving right in, and today we're going to be looking at violations of laws and regulations.
Section 4.5, right?
That's right, Section 4.5 of the FDIC Manual of Examination Policies.
Violations, obviously incredibly important for us as examiners.
Yeah,
We really got to have a good grasp of this.
absolutely. We're going to go, deeper than maybe some of you are used to
Yeah.
into some of the specifics, but I think, everyone listening to this probably has a pretty good baseline grasp of it.
Right.
But we're going to get into the real nitty-gritty.
The nitty-gritty. Yeah.
So starting with the fundamentals.
Yep.
What exactly is a violation? I mean, we throw this term around. Like, what does the FDIC consider a violation?
Well, the manual lays it out pretty straightforward.
Well,
It's any action or inaction by a bank that's not in line with federal or state statutes, regulations,
Right.
administrative rules, all those good things.
it could be something they do or don't do
Exactly.
that's contrary to those things.
Precisely. It's all about making sure the banks are sticking to the rules of the game,
Right, yeah.
the rules that keep our financial system safe and sound.
Okay, so that makes sense. But, I mean, a violation, like, that could be a pretty wide range of things, right?
Absolutely.
It could be, like, a minor paperwork error. It could be some major, criminal activity.
For sure. For sure.
So how do we, as examiners, like, differentiate between those? What are we really looking at?
Yeah, you're right. It's a spectrum.
Yeah.
A missing signature on a form is a whole different ballgame than, say, ignoring lending limits.
Right.
It's about assessing not just the violation itself, but the intent behind it.
That context.
Exactly. Was it an honest mistake? Was there negligence?
Right.
Or was it intentional noncompliance? That's a big one.
Okay, so figuring out the
And
why
is key.
behind a violation is really important.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that why. Like, why are violations such a big deal? What are the consequences for banks, even for individuals?
Well, the stakes are high. Banks are playing with fire when they violate regulations.
Okay.
You're talking potential financial losses, legal battles, damage to their reputation in the community.
Yeah, none of those are good.
Not good for business at all. And then you have those civil money penalties, the CMPs,
Right.
under Section 8 of the FDI Act.
Okay.
Those can be hefty fines, and they can hit both the bank itself and the people involved in the violation.
Individuals, wow.
Yeah, so it's serious stuff.
Okay, that makes sense. So the consequences can be pretty serious. What about the board of directors? The folks overseeing the bank, are they off the hook if a violation happens?
Not so fast.
Okay.
Directors can actually be held personally liable for losses
Right.
tied to violations,
Oh, wow.
especially when you're talking about illegal loans or non-conforming assets.
So that oversight role, it's not just a title.
It's a big responsibility, and there's a lot of personal risk involved.
Okay, so let's talk about how we, as examiners, actually spot these violations during an examination.
Okay.
Seems like a lot of ground to cover.
Well, you need a sharp eye, attention to detail.
Right.
When we find a potential violation, we document it very carefully in the report of examination, the ROE.
Right, the ROE.
It's not just checking a box. We need specific descriptions, details about the violation, any director approvals or disagreements,
Okay.
the potential impact.
So that documentation, it's crucial.
Oh, it's critical. This documentation is what backs up our findings, and it can even be used in enforcement actions down the line.
So we're not just, writing a report, we're building a case.
Exactly. Precision is key.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's get into some specifics now. What are some of those common violations we see outlined in the manual?
All right. Well, legal lending limit violations are a big one.
All right.
Got to make sure those banks aren't lending out more than they're allowed.
Even if a borrower's debt is spread out over multiple notes, right?
Absolutely. Courts tend to focus on the note that pushes the borrower over the limit,
Okay.
not just the individual notes themselves.
So just to clarify, if a loan was initially within the limit, but then later, goes over because of a decline in the bank's capital, would that be a violation?
Not necessarily, unless the loan was renewed at that higher amount, exceeding the limit.
Okay.
We're looking for violations at the point of origination or renewal. Changes in bank capital down the line, they matter, but they don't create a violation retroactively
Got it.
if the loan was compliant to begin with.
Okay, that's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
What else are we seeing a lot of?
Non-conforming loans to insiders, that's another big one.
Right, insider loans.
We have to scrutinize these loans very carefully.
Yeah, loans to directors, officers, employees.
Yep, and anyone else closely tied to them.
And their related interests.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Got to make sure they comply with regulations like Regulation O
Hmm.
and Section 337.3 of the FDIC rules and regulations.
Right, all about preventing conflicts of interest.
Absolutely.
So are there specific amounts or thresholds for these insider loans that we should be looking for?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Regulation O sets limits on the total credit to exactly.
Got it.
Yeah.
What other types of insider transactions should we be watching out for?
Well, beyond just those dollar limits, Regulation O also prohibits any kind of preferential treatment for insiders.
Okay.
So things like below market interest rates, giving them extended repayment terms they don't qualify for,
Right.
or weak collateral requirements compared to other similar borrowers. Those are all red flags.
Okay. So really scrutinizing the terms of those loans.
Yep. Got to make sure everyone's playing on a level field.
Makes sense. What about transactions with affiliates? Are there specific regulations for those?
Yes, we have sections 23A and 23B of the Federal Reserve Act, and then section 18 of the FDI Act.
Okay.
Those lay out the rules for transactions between member banks and their affiliates, setting limits on loans, asset purchases, guarantees, all that good stuff.
Okay. So if a bank exceeds those limits or engages in transactions that don't seem to be at arm's length,
Right.
like, say, buying something from an affiliate at an inflated price, those be violations.
Exactly. We need to make sure these transactions are fair to the bank, that they aren't taking on unnecessary risk.
And documentation is key here, too, right?
Absolutely. Proper approvals, clear records, it's all vital.
Okay. Now, what about real estate? I know there are tons of regulations surrounding real estate lending.
Oh, yeah. Real estate is a whole world unto itself.
Right.
We have Part 365 of the FDIC rules and regulations,
Okay.
which requires banks to have solid policies for real estate lending.
Right.
And Part 323 mandates appraisals from qualified appraisers for certain transactions.
So we need to be checking those appraisals
Yep, making sure they meet the standards.
and ensuring the bank's lending practices align with their policies.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about loans secured by securities?
Ah, yes. Non-conforming securities securing loans.
Right.
That's another potential problem area.
Yeah.
Violations here could involve running afoul of Regulation U, which governs loans for buying margin stock, or Section 23A of the Federal Reserve Act, which restricts using an affiliate stock as collateral.
So it's all about making sure those securities are the right kind
Exactly.
and that they meet all the regulatory requirements.
Yep, those details are important.
Okay, so then there's also the issue of securities that were unlawfully acquired or held.
Right, can't forget about those.
What are the main things we should be aware of there?
Well, Part 362 of the FDIC rules and regulations, along with various state laws, they put limits on the types of securities banks can hold.
So if we stumble upon common stock or other equity investments that aren't allowed, that's a violation,
Generally speaking, yes.
unless they fall under some specific exceptions.
Right, there are always exceptions.
Okay.
Like investments in subsidiaries holding bank premises or stock in bank service corporations.
Okay, so those are important to know.
Definitely, those nuances can change your whole assessment.
And then there's other real estate.
Yeah, stuff like properties acquired through foreclosure.
Right.
State laws often dictate how long banks can hold on to those properties, so we need to be aware of those timeframes and make sure the banks are playing by the rules.
So what happens if a bank decides to charge off a non-conforming asset? Does that mean the violation is cleared?
Ah, that's a common misconception.
Huh?
Charging off a non-conforming asset doesn't make the violation disappear.
Okay, so it's still a violation.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. If a bank makes a loan that goes over the lending limit, and then later they charge it off, the violation already happened when they made that loan.
Right, so it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card.
Exactly. Can't just erase those violations with a charge-off.
Makes sense. And then we also have that category of all other violations
Oh, yes, the catch-all.
that aren't tied to a specific asset,
Right.
like violations of the FDI Act, FDIC rules and regulations,
Mhm.
Bank Holding Company Act, all that good stuff.
All those fun acronyms.
Right.
It's important to be well-versed in a wide range of regulations
Mhm.
for those times.
Yeah, it's not just about knowing the rules for loans or securities. It's about understanding the broader regulatory landscape.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about non-conformance with guidelines that are part of regulations, like those appendices to Parts 364 or 365 of the FDIC rules and regulations.
Okay, so those aren't technically violations of law, but they're still important.
Exactly. If a bank significantly deviates from those guidelines, it could point to weaknesses in their operations.
So it's something we should be paying attention to and documenting.
For sure. It's all about getting a complete picture of the bank's risk profile. It's not always black and white.
Right, sometimes it's those shades of gray that really matter.
Exactly, those subtle signs that something might be off.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, defining violations, looking at different types. But before we go further,
Yeah.
I want to shift gears a bit and talk about bank management
Okay.
and their role in all of this.
Good point. Management effectiveness is crucial when it comes to preventing and addressing violations.
Right. It's not just about having policies and procedures in place.
Right.
It's about how those are actually implemented and enforced.
That's where the rubber meets the road. When we assign management ratings, we pay very close attention to how well a bank is adhering to the laws and regulations, but also to their own internal policies.
So a bank can have a great compliance program on paper, but if it's not being followed, it's not doing much good.
Exactly. We're looking for a real commitment to compliance from the top down.
So the board of directors, senior management, they all need to be on board.
Absolutely. They need clear policies and procedures, regular training for employees, robust monitoring systems to catch problems early.
It sounds like compliance really needs to be part of the bank's DNA.
That's a great way to put it. It can't just be a side project or something they do when they have time.
It needs to be woven into everything they do.
Exactly. Compliance needs to be part of their daily routine.
All right, we'll delve deeper into the role of management in part 2 of our deep dive. But for now, we're going to take a quick break. Be sure to stick around because there's a lot more to uncover.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. In this part, we're going to put our knowledge to the test.
Yeah, let's get into some real-world scenarios, the kind of things that we as examiners might encounter.
Exactly, because we've all been there, right?
Yeah.
Those situations where it's not so clear cut.
Right, those gray areas.
Exactly. So let's start with those legal lending limit violations.
Okay.
Now, the manual, it makes it clear that we generally only cite the note that pushes the borrower over that limit, right?
Right.
But what happens when you've got multiple notes that are dispersed on the same day and their combined total, it exceeds the limit.
Okay, yeah.
Is it just one note in violation, or are all those notes part of a single transaction?
Yeah, that's a good question and one that I've definitely struggled with before.
It's a tricky one.
How do we determine if those notes are a single transaction or multiple separate ones?
Well, the manual gives us some guidance, but it really comes down to the specifics of the situation. Okay, you need to look at the purpose of the loans. Were they approved together? Was there any connection between them?
Right.
Did the borrower intend to use the funds as one lump sum?
So it's not just about when the money went out, but the intent and the whole picture.
Exactly. Let's say a borrower gets two loans on the same day, one for working capital, one to buy equipment. Those are probably separate transactions, even though they were dispersed at the same time.
Okay.
But if a borrower gets two loans, say, to finance different stages of a single construction project,
Right.
that's more likely to be considered a single transaction.
So we're really trying to understand the story behind those loans and using our judgment
Exactly.
to figure out if they should be treated as one.
It's all about piecing together the puzzle.
Right. And I imagine documentation is really important in these cases.
Oh, absolutely. We need to be able to explain why we cited a violation, especially when it's a judgment call like this.
Right. So our ROE comments need to lay it all out, the facts, the regulations, and why we think there's a violation.
Yep. Got to build a solid case, something that holds up under scrutiny.
Okay, let's move on to insider loans.
All right.
This is another area where that definition of insider, it could be a bit fuzzy.
Oh, for sure. It's not just directors and officers.
Right, it's broader than that.
We also need to consider their related interests, family members, businesses they own or control, trusts they benefit from.
Okay, so it gets complicated quickly.
It can, but all those folks fall under that insider umbrella.
So if a director's spouse gets a loan from the bank, even if the director wasn't involved in the approval?
Yeah, still an insider loan.
Okay.
And the manual is clear. We need to add up all those loans to an insider and their related interests.
Right, to see if they're complying.
Exactly. We can't look at each loan in a vacuum. Got to see the big picture.
Okay, and with insider loans, we need to really scrutinize the terms and conditions, right?
Oh, absolutely. Regulation O, no preferential treatment, remember? So what are we looking for? Interest rates way below market, extended repayment terms that don't make sense, collateral requirements that are super lax.
Okay.
All those things. Those are red flags.
So it's not just about the dollar amount, it's about whether those terms are fair.
Exactly. We're making sure the playing field is level.
Okay, what about those affiliate transactions? One of the tricky things there is just figuring out who all the bank's affiliates are.
That's true. It's not always as simple as looking at a list of subsidiaries.
Right, sometimes it's more complicated than that.
We have to do some digging. Ownership structures, voting agreements, management interlocks, anything that suggests a connection.
So it's almost like detective work.
Sometimes it feels that way. Got to piece together the clues.
And once we've figured out who the affiliates are, what are some key things we're looking for when reviewing transactions between them and the bank?
Well, we need to be really careful with those covered transactions. Those are the ones that are subject to those limits we talked about from sections 23A and 23B of the Federal Reserve Act
Right.
and section 18J of the FDI Act.
So things like excessive loans, buying assets at inflated prices, or guarantees that put the bank at risk.
Exactly. Those are red flags.
Okay, so even if a transaction technically falls within those limits, if it doesn't seem like it was done at arm's length, that would raise concerns.
Absolutely. We're looking at the substance of the deal, not just the paperwork.
And of course, documentation is important here too.
Always. Always. The bank needs to be able to show that the transaction was properly authorized, that the terms were fair, and that it doesn't put the bank at undue risk.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about how we as examiners document these violations in the ROE.
Right.
Any best practices we should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, clarity is key. Remember, the ROE isn't just for the bank. It's a record of our findings.
Right.
And it could be used in enforcement actions or legal proceedings down the road.
So it needs to be accurate, thorough, well-organized.
Exactly. So what do we need to include? Well, first, we need to clearly state which regulation has been violated.
Okay, so we're laying the legal groundwork.
Right. We can either quote the relevant section or give a clear paraphrase.
Okay, and then what?
Then we need to describe the facts of the violation, and we need to be specific.
Okay, so instead of just saying, loan exceeded lending limit,
Right.
we'd give more details about the loan amount, the borrower, and the approval process, things like that.
Exactly. No room for ambiguity.
And what about quantifying the violation? Is that always necessary?
It depends. For violations tied to specific assets, like non-conforming loans or securities, we usually include the book value
Okay.
to show the magnitude.
But for other types of violations, like policy or procedure violations, it might not be so easy to put a number on it.
Right. In those cases, we focus on describing the nature and scope of the violation,
Okay.
the potential risks, and any mitigating factors.
And of course, we always include the bank's response and any corrective actions.
Absolutely. That shows us whether they're taking it seriously.
It sounds like there's a real art to documenting violations.
There is. We need to be thorough, accurate, and clear, and always keep in mind the potential consequences of our findings.
It's a big responsibility.
It is. Our ROE comments can have a real impact, so we need to approach this task carefully and professionally.
Well said. Now, before we wrap up this section, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about those nuances in the regulations.
Okay.
It seems like a lot of these violations, they come from misinterpretations or oversights.
It's true. Banking regulations, they're complex.
Right, and they're constantly changing.
Exactly. It's hard to keep up, even for the experts.
So what's our role in helping banks navigate this complex world?
Well, we're not just enforcers, we're also educators and consultants.
Okay.
We help banks understand why a violation happened and how to prevent it in the future.
So we're partners with them, in a way?
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
We're all working together to keep the banking system safe and sound.
Our goal is to help them build a strong compliance culture.
Absolutely. A culture where compliance is everyone's responsibility.
And that brings us back to the role of bank management, which is where we'll pick up in part 3 of our deep dive. All right, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into these violations of laws and regulations. We've been through a lot, from the specifics to how we document it all, but now let's talk about bank management, their role in making sure everything is on the up and up.
Yeah, because you can have all the rules and regulations you want, but if the folks at the top aren't taking it seriously, well, compliance kind of goes out the window.
So how do we as examiners assess that commitment? What are we looking for to see if management is really walking the walk?
Well, one of the first things we look at is, what we call the tone at the top. Are the board and senior management really involved in overseeing compliance? Are they setting clear expectations? Are they giving compliance enough resources?
Right.
Are they holding employees accountable?
So it's not just about having a compliance officer, it's about making compliance part of the bank's culture, right?
Exactly. It needs to be baked into everything they do.
Woven into the fabric of the bank.
That's it. We want to see compliance integrated into their daily operations. Everything from loan approvals to account openings to vendor management, even cybersecurity.
So when we're on site, what are some things we're looking at to gauge that level of commitment?
Well, we're going to look at their compliance program, of course. Are their policies and procedures up to date? Do they cover all the bases? And importantly, are they actually following those policies?
Right, because having a policy on paper doesn't mean much if they're not using it.
Exactly. That's where our testing and observation come in. We'll also look at their training programs.
Yep.
Are employees getting regular training on compliance? Is it relevant to their jobs?
So not just a generic training everyone has to sit through.
Right, it needs to be tailored and effective. And we'll also look at their monitoring and testing processes.
Okay, so how are they identifying and addressing compliance gaps?
Yeah, are they actively monitoring their performance? Do they have systems in place to track things, identify trends, and catch potential violations early?
So they're being proactive, looking for weaknesses, not just waiting for us to find them.
Exactly. And when they do find issues, we want to see that they're addressed quickly and appropriately.
Okay, so reporting is important. Is management getting regular updates on compliance?
That's right. We want to see good information flowing to the right people and that management is using it to make decisions.
So a data-driven approach,
Yeah,
not just reacting to problems.
exactly. The best banks are always looking for ways to improve.
Now, what happens if we see signs that management isn't taking compliance seriously? Like, what if there's a pattern of violations, or they don't seem to care about fixing things?
That's a big red flag.
Yeah.
It could mean a lower management rating and maybe even supervisory action.
Speaking of the management rating, how do violations factor into that?
Well, they're a key part of it. The severity, how often they happen, and how management responds, all that can impact the rating.
So a few minor violations that were fixed quickly might not be a big deal, but a pattern of serious ones, or just ignoring them, that's not good.
Right. And remember, the management rating is more than just a number. It's our overall assessment of how well management can run the bank safely and soundly.
So a weak compliance culture, that can point to bigger problems.
Exactly. All right, now that we've